What if I told you that Australia has a history so dark, so deliberately hidden, that most Australians have no idea what actually happened on their own soil? We're not talking about ancient mysteries or colonial legends. We're talking about government-sanctioned massacres, secret policies, and systematic erasures that continued well into living memory. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to walk through 50 verified moments in Australian history that somehow never made it into your school textbooks. These aren't conspiracy theories or exaggerated claims. These are documented events with government records, eyewitness accounts, and physical evidence that got quietly buried under more comfortable narratives about pioneering spirit and mateship. Some of these facts are uncomfortable, some are shocking, and some will make you wonder why you're only hearing about them now. So, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the forbidden corners of Australian history, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Get comfortable, and let's talk about the things they never wanted you to know. Fact 1. The Frontier Wars Death Toll Australian History, as typically taught, covers Cook, the First Fleet, gold rushes, Gallipoli. What you don't learn is that there was a war that lasted over 140 years and killed more Australians than World War I. The Frontier Wars were conflicts between European settlers and Aboriginal Australians from 1788 to approximately 1934. That's not a typo. 1934. People were killing Aboriginal Australians in organised campaigns while your grandparents were alive, while jazz played on radios, while people drove cars and went to cinemas. Nobody on the European side kept careful records of Aboriginal deaths. Why would they? For most of that period, killing Aboriginal people wasn't murder, it was pest control. Official estimates suggest at least 20,000 Aboriginal deaths, though historians now believe the real number could be 60,000 to over 100,000. Some researchers argue it could be even higher, but we'll never know because the perpetrators weren't interested in documenting their crimes. Australia lost about 60,000 soldiers in World War I and built memorials everywhere, created a National Day of Remembrance, made it the defining trauma of early Australian identity. The Frontier Wars, which potentially killed just as many people on Australian soil over a much longer period, got no memorials, no Remembrance Day, and weren't even called wars in official histories until recently. They were called incidents or dispersals or pacification efforts, which are interesting ways to describe systematic killing. The conflicts were grinding massacres and reprisal killings. Settlers moved into new territory. Aboriginal people resisted, sometimes by spearing cattle or attacking isolated homesteads, which from their perspective was defending their land from invaders. Settlers responded with punitive expeditions, riding out to Aboriginal camps and shooting everyone they found, men, women, children. Then there would be revenge attacks, then more expeditions. On and on for decades, moving slowly across the continent as the frontier expanded. This was often legal or tacitly approved. Governors would issue proclamations saying Aboriginal people had equal protection under British law, then ignore settler hunting parties. The disconnect between official policy and actual practice was spectacular. On paper, Aboriginal people had rights. In practice, those rights meant nothing. The native police in Queensland were particularly brutal. This was a paramilitary force made up of Aboriginal men from different areas, commanded by white officers that existed from 1848 to 1904 specifically to hunt down and kill Aboriginal resistance fighters. The logic was twisted but effective. Aboriginal trackers knew the land, knew the hiding places, could follow trails that white officers couldn't see. And by recruiting Aboriginal men from different tribal groups, the native police exploited existing tensions and prevented unified Aboriginal resistance. The native police kept journals. Some of those journals survive. They're chilling reading. Casual entries about dispersing groups of Aboriginal people, which meant killing them. Numbers of people shot, locations, dates, all written in bureaucratic language that obscures the violence. Dispersed a camp of approximately 30 natives means they rode in and killed 30 people. And speaking of institutions designed to eliminate Aboriginal people, let's talk about a policy so racist it became the global blueprint for apartheid. Fact 2. The White Australia Policy's global influence. The White Australia policy wasn't just local embarrassment, it was so thoroughly racist, so comprehensively designed to exclude non-white people, that it became the blueprint for South African apartheid and influenced American segregation policies. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 was one of the first laws passed after Federation. The explicit purpose was to keep Australia completely white. The act required immigrants to pass a dictation test in a European language chosen by the immigration officer. If they didn't want you, they'd test you in a language you didn't speak. Records show officers giving the test in Gaelic to Chinese applicants, Italian to Indians, even obscure languages like Albanian or Maltese. The test was absurdly arbitrary. An immigration officer could decide they didn't like the look of you and administer the test in whatever language they knew you couldn't speak. There are documented cases of highly educated polyglots being failed because the officer tested them in the one language they didn't know. It was racial discrimination with a thin veneer of objectivity. This was mainstream policy defended across the political spectrum. Prime Minister Edmund Barton stated in Parliament that equality was never intended to apply to the equality of the Englishman and the Chinaman. He wasn't some fringe extremist. He was the first Prime Minister, one of the architects of federation, a man whose face appears on commemorative coins. And he said this openly in Parliament, with widespread support. The Labour Party strongly supported it, fearing Asian workers would undercut wages. The party that supposedly stood for workers' rights and equality was one of the strongest advocates for racial exclusion. The logic was that Australian workers needed protection from cheap foreign labour, and by foreign, they meant non-white. European immigrants were generally fine. It was specifically about keeping Australia white. The policy extended beyond immigration. Non-white residents already in Australia faced restrictions on where they could live, work, and marry. Aboriginal Australians could be prohibited from entering certain towns, even towns built on their traditional land. Chinese Australians who left the country weren't guaranteed re-entry, even if born here. Some left to visit family in China and couldn't come back. Others were told they could return, but were then denied at the border anyway. The White Australia policy remained official until 1973. If you're over 50, you were alive when Australia had explicitly race-based immigration. This wasn't colonial-era policy. This was modern Australia, with television, universities, international trade relationships, United Nations membership, and explicitly racist immigration law. South African officials studied it when designing apartheid in the late 1940s. They sent delegations to Australia to learn how to legally segregate while maintaining international respectability. The dictation test concept was adapted for restricting black South African movement. Australia essentially taught South Africa how to do apartheid in a way that looked bureaucratic, rather than overtly racist. That's quite a legacy. And speaking of bureaucratic language hiding horrific intent, let's talk about what assimilation actually meant. Fact 3. The stolen generations continued until 1970. The systematic removal of Aboriginal children from their families was official policy until 1970. The last known forced removal happened in the early 1970s. This was happening while Led Zeppelin topped the charts, while people watched colour television, while Australia sent troops to Vietnam. The practice began in the late 1800s based on a theory that Aboriginal people were dying out, and mixed-race children should be removed and raised white to breed out Aboriginal identity. The full theory was that full-blood Aboriginal people would naturally die out through disease and attrition, which was considered inevitable. But half-caste children, if left with their Aboriginal families, would perpetuate Aboriginal culture. The solution, according to government policy, was to remove these children and assimilate them into white society. After a few generations of intermarriage with white people, Aboriginal identity would simply cease to exist, absorbed into white Australia. This was official policy endorsed by governments, churches, and welfare organisations. Western Australia's Chief Protector AO. Neville testified to a 1934 Royal Commission about his plan to breed out the colour within 3 generations. He had charts showing how skin would lighten through intermarriage. He presented this as scientific, progressive policy. He genuinely believed he was helping Aboriginal people by eliminating Aboriginal identity. The genocidal logic was presented as humanitarian intervention. Children were removed for reasons ranging from neglect to simply being Aboriginal. A government officer could decide a child would be better off in white society and take them. There was no appeal process, no requirement to prove the family was unfit, no consideration of the trauma caused. The officer's judgment was absolute. Some children were told their parents were dead, some parents were told their children died. Siblings were separated and sent to different institutions or families, never to see each other again. Between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10, Aboriginal children were removed from 1910 to 1970. In some areas and some periods, the rate was even higher. Entire communities lost most of their children. Mothers would hide children when government officials came to town. Some families kept moving to avoid authorities. Others tried to make their children look as Aboriginal as possible, keeping them out of white-style clothes and white-influenced activities, hoping the authorities would consider them full blood, and therefore leave them alone under the assumption they'd die out naturally anyway. The institutions where children were placed were often brutal. Physical and sexual abuse was common, and in many cases, systematic. Children were punished for speaking their native languages or practicing culture. They were trained for menial labor, domestic service for girls, farm work, or manual labor for boys. The official reasoning was that they were being prepared for useful roles in white society. The reality was often indentured servitude or worse. The Kinchela Aboriginal Boys Training Home in New South Wales was one of many such institutions. Boys sent there in the 1950s and 60s later testified about systematic physical abuse, sexual abuse, and forced labor. They were hired out to local farms and businesses. With their wages kept by the institution, they weren't being educated or trained, they were being exploited. The 1997 Bringing Them Home report documented this, with testimony from thousands who'd been removed. The testimonies are devastating. People in their 60s and 70s describing being torn from their mothers as children, describing abuse in institutions, describing never seeing their families again, describing growing up without knowing their language, their culture, even their real names in some cases. The report recommended apology and compensation. Prime Minister John Howard refused, arguing current generations couldn't be responsible for past actions and that an apology would imply ongoing guilt. The subtext was that apologizing might create legal liability for compensation claims. The government was more worried about money than about acknowledging trauma. The apology came in 2008 from Kevin Rudd. People forcibly removed as children waited their entire lives for acknowledgement. Some died before it came, and even the apology came with no meaningful compensation or structural change. It was symbolic acknowledgement without material repair. And speaking of structural violence continuing far too long, let's talk about what happened when Aboriginal people resisted. Fact 4. The Myall Creek Massacre and why convictions were rare. In 1838, white settlers and convict stockmen murdered at least 28 Aboriginal people at Myall Creek in New South Wales. They tied men, women, and children together, led them from their camp, and hacked them to death. Bodies were burned to destroy evidence. This was not unusual. What made Myall Creek different was that 7 perpetrators were hanged for murder. This was one of the only times white men were executed for killing Aboriginal people. The white community's reaction tells you how normal these massacres were. The convictions caused settler outrage, not at the massacre, but at punishing white men for killing Aboriginal people. Protests erupted. Newspapers editorialized about injustice. The defense argued Aboriginal people were subhuman with no rights. The first trial ended in acquittal despite overwhelming evidence. The jury refused to convict. A retrial resulted in 7 death sentences. When they were hanged, there was public mourning. They were treated as martyrs. The conviction sent a message, but not the intended one. The message wasn't "don't kill Aboriginal people." It was "don't leave witnesses or evidence." Massacres continued, but perpetrators became more careful. They killed everyone so no one could testify. They burned bodies or dumped them in rivers. Station owners warned stockmen on punitive expeditions to leave no survivors. Entire communities were wiped out with no official record. Maybe a brief police note about dispersing Aboriginal people, the euphemism for killing them. Historians have documented at least 150 frontier massacres, but the real number is certainly much higher. And speaking of official records obscuring violence, let's talk about a shockingly recent massacre. Fact 5. The Coniston Massacre of 1928. In 1928, one of the last large-scale massacres occurred in the Northern Territory. At least 60 and possibly over 100 Aboriginal people died. The year was 1928. Australia had fought World War I, had functioning democracy, was developing cities. And in the outback, organised mass killings continued. After a white dingo trapper named Frederick Brooks was killed, reportedly in retaliation for abducting and assaulting Aboriginal women, Constable William George Murray organised punitive expeditions over several months. Murray's reports claim he killed 31 Aboriginal people in self-defence. Witnesses suggest the real number exceeded 100, including women, children, and elderly people with no connection to Brooks's death. The expeditions were hunting parties. A board of inquiry concluded Murray acted appropriately. No charges were filed. Murray was transferred. The official death toll was set at 31, ruled justifiable homicides. Coniston is cited as the last known large-scale massacre. Last known. The qualifier matters. It was the last with enough documentation for historians to study. Violence against Aboriginal people continued in forms leaving fewer records. And speaking of violence rewritten into comfortable narratives, let's talk about the gold rushes. Fact 6. The Lambing Flat Riots and Legalized Chinese Persecution. The gold rushes are taught as romantic prosperity stories. What gets left out is systematic violence against Chinese miners and government policies that legalize persecution. Chinese miners often succeeded more than Europeans because they worked cooperatively, pooling resources and labor. They were willing to rework claims that Europeans had abandoned as played out, using patient techniques to extract gold that Europeans missed. They used different mining methods, some brought from China, that were more effective for certain types of deposits. This success bred resentment. The Lambing Flat riots in 1860-61 were the worst. European miners, believing Chinese miners were taking their gold, organized violent attacks. In June 1861, about 2,000 European miners attacked the Chinese camp at Lambing Flat. They destroyed tents, burned belongings, and beat miners. Some Chinese miners were scalped, their queues cut off as trophies and paraded through town. Others were beaten so severely they died from their injuries. Women and children weren't spared. Rioters marched through town carrying a Chinese man's head on a pole. This was 1861. Charles Darwin had published On the Origin of Species 2 years earlier. Australia was a functioning colony with courts and police, and a mob paraded with a severed head, celebrating the expulsion of Chinese miners, while authorities did essentially nothing to stop them. Some rioters were arrested and tried, but most were acquitted by sympathetic juries of European miners who saw nothing wrong with what had happened. The sentences for those convicted were light, sometimes just months in jail for participating in a race riot that killed people. The message was clear: violence against Chinese people would be tolerated, but the legislative response was worse. Rather than protecting Chinese miners, New South Wales passed laws restricting Chinese immigration and imposing special taxes. The Chinese Immigration Act of 1861 limited the number of Chinese passengers ships could carry and required substantial entry taxes. The government responded to racist violence by punishing the victims. Victoria had passed similar laws in 1855, including a £10 poll tax per Chinese arrival, an enormous sum equivalent to months of wages. Laws restricted where Chinese could mine and what percentage of crews could be Chinese. These weren't fringe policies. They were mainstream government responses to Chinese success and European resentment, essentially codifying racism into law. Violence wasn't limited to Lambing Flat. Anti-Chinese riots, attacks, and expulsions happened across goldfields in Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland. Chinese miners were beaten, robbed, sometimes killed. Their camps were burned, their claims were jumped. And the legal system offered little protection because Chinese testimony wasn't given equal weight in court. A Chinese witness needed multiple corroborating Chinese witnesses to equal one European witness. This anti-Chinese sentiment from the Gold Rush era became the foundation for the White Australia policy. The arguments were identical. Chinese workers would undercut European workers. Chinese people were incompatible with Australian society. White Australia needed protection from Asian immigration. And speaking of conflicts written out of history, let's talk about Australia's only military coup. Fact 7. The Rum Rebellion was actually a military coup. In 1808, the New South Wales court overthrew the governor and installed their own government. This was a military coup, an armed force removing legitimate government and seizing power. It's usually taught as a personality clash rather than treason. Governor William Bligh was appointed in 1806. He had instructions to break the Corps' power. They'd turned themselves into a corrupt cartel controlling the colony's economy through rum distribution, land grants, and convict labor. Bligh challenged illegal land grants, restricted rum trade, and arrested Officer John MacArthur on corruption charges. The Corps marched on Government House with fixed bayonets, arrested Bligh, and installed their commander as lieutenant governor. Bligh was held under house arrest for over a year while the Corps ruled. This continued until 1810, when Britain sent a new governor with his own regiment. Johnston was court-martialed and cashiered, relatively light punishment for overthrowing government. MacArthur avoided court-martial, but was banned from returning. Most officers faced no consequences. The rebellion gets softened because rebels became founders of influential families. MacArthur became the father of the wool industry. It's uncomfortable acknowledging a founding dynasty started with treason. And speaking of uncomfortable military truths, let's talk about Sydney Harbour during World War II. Fact 8. Japanese submarines attacked Sydney Harbour. On May 31st, 1942, 3 Japanese midget submarines entered Sydney Harbour and attacked Allied shipping. One was sunk, another fired torpedoes that missed USS Chicago and hit HMAS Kudable, killing 21 sailors. This should be major World War II history. Enemy submarines penetrating Australia's largest city harbour and killing sailors. But it's not widely known and was actively suppressed. The attack was massive embarrassment. Sydney Harbour was supposedly defended by submarine nets, patrol boats, and coastal artillery. 3 enemy submarines got through and attacked, suggesting serious vulnerabilities. The response was to downplay it. Newspapers reported with heavy censorship. The full defensive failures weren't disclosed. Navy investigations stayed classified. When the first submarine was raised, the 2-man crew's bodies were given full military funeral with honours, gun salute, and marked graves. Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould said they'd shown courage and deserved respect despite being enemies. This was kept quiet. Japanese submarines also laid mines off ports, sank ships along the coast, and shelled Sydney's eastern suburbs. Over 20 ships were sunk in Australian waters. This doesn't fit the comfortable narrative of distant battlefields. And speaking of events complicating narratives, let's talk about mutiny between allies. Fact 9. The Battle of Brisbane. In November 1942, a two-day riot between Australian and American servicemen resulted in one Australian soldier killed, hundreds injured, and the city under military control. This was large-scale urban combat between allies during a world war. Over 80,000 American troops were stationed in Brisbane, more than the city's entire male population. Americans were paid significantly better, creating resentment. They competed for Australian women's attention. Cultural and racial tensions ran high. On November 26th, American military police tried arresting an Australian soldier at a bar. Other Australians intervened. Fighting erupted. Soon hundreds fought in the streets. Fighting continued into the next day. Australian soldiers armed themselves and attacked American positions. Military police responded with force. Reports mentioned gunfire, though most fighting involved fists, bottles, and improvised weapons. Authorities restored order by declaring the area off limits and flooding it with military police. Private James Stein died from injuries. Official accounts said he was struck by a vehicle, but some witnesses claimed he was shot. Hundreds needed medical treatment. Both governments suppressed news. Australian press faced wartime censorship. American military classified documents. For decades, the Battle of Brisbane was barely mentioned. This revealed serious alliance tensions both governments wanted hidden. And speaking of realities not matching narratives, let's talk about what Australia did to its own citizens. Fact 10. Australia interned its own citizens. During World War II, Australia interned over 7,000 people, including Australian citizens whose only crime was Japanese, German, or Italian ancestry. Some were born in Australia and imprisoned without trial because of ethnicity. German and Italian Australians were classified as enemy aliens, regardless of how long they'd lived here or their connection to Nazi or fascist governments. After Japan entered the war, Japanese Australians faced the same. The process was arbitrary. Some internees had expressed pro-German or pro-Japanese sentiments. Others were just prominent community members authorities deemed risks. Still others seem to have been interned simply for being German, Japanese, or Italian. War, many had nothing to return to. Camp war, many had nothing to return to. Camp conditions varied. Some were humane. Others were harsh with poor food, inadequate medical care, and brutal guards. Tatura and Victoria held over 1,000 in overcrowded conditions. Cowra in New South Wales saw a 1944 breakout, resulting in over 230 Japanese deaths. A person could be born in Australia, speak only English, have no connection to their parents' birth country, and still be imprisoned for years without trial because of ethnicity. Unlike the United States, which eventually apologized and compensated Japanese internees, Australia has never offered formal apology or compensation to most interned. Jewish refugees who'd fled Nazi Germany were sometimes interned as enemy aliens because they held German passports, despite being Nazi victims. And speaking of absurdities, let's talk about a political crisis that nearly destroyed Australia's government. Fact 11. The 1975 constitutional crisis was nearly a coup. On November 11, 1975, Governor-General Sir John Kerr dismissed elected Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and installed the opposition leader as caretaker PM. This is the only time a Governor-General has removed an elected Prime Minister. Whether it was legitimate constitutional act or disguised coup is still debated. Whitlam's Labor government won office in 1972, ending 23 years of Conservative rule. They implemented sweeping reforms including universal healthcare, free university education, Aboriginal land rights, no-fault divorce, and Vietnam War withdrawal. These reforms created powerful enemies. By 1975, Whitlam faced scandals, economic problems, and poor management. Opposition leader Malcolm Fraser controlled the Senate. In October 1975, the Senate refused to pass budget bills. Without a budget, the government couldn't function. Whitlam refused to call an election, arguing Senate blockage was illegitimate, and he had House confidence. Fraser insisted Whitlam should call an election or resign. On November 11th, Whitlam went to Government House to ask for a half-Senate election. Instead, Kerr dismissed him, appointed Fraser, and called a double dissolution. Whitlam learned he'd been fired walking out of Government House. The dismissal was legally possible under reserve powers for extraordinary circumstances, but it was unprecedented and widely seen as illegitimate. The Governor-General acts on PM advice, not fires the PM. Evidence suggests Kerr coordinated with Fraser and Chief Justice Barwick before dismissing Whitlam. Kerr knew if he consulted Whitlam, Whitlam would advise the Queen to dismiss Kerr first, so Kerr acted in secret. That's not reluctantly using reserve powers. That's plotting to remove government. Evidence also suggests British and American intelligence involvement. Whitlam had angered Americans by criticizing US bases in Australia. The CIA was running operations and worried about Whitlam threatening them. Some historians argue the CIA encouraged or assisted removal. The December election resulted in Fraser's landslide victory. But legitimacy has never been settled. And speaking of democracy not functioning normally, let's talk about Aboriginal voting rights. Fact 12. Aboriginal people couldn't vote until 1965. Aboriginal Australians didn't get unconditional federal voting rights until 1962. Queensland didn't allow state voting until 1965. People who'd lived here for over 60,000 years couldn't vote until some of your parents were alive. The history varies by state, showing how inconsistent and arbitrary restrictions were. The 1901 Constitution excluded Aboriginal people from the census unless already entitled to vote in their state. This created bizarre situations where Aboriginal voting rights depended on which state you lived in. South Australia gave Aboriginal people the vote in 1856, but most states actively prevented it. Western Australia didn't allow it unless they gave up Aboriginal identity and lived as whites, meaning abandoning culture, community, and often family. That wasn't voting rights. That was cultural erasure in exchange for political participation. The Commonwealth Electoral Act 1962 finally gave all Aboriginal people federal voting rights regardless of state laws. But voting wasn't compulsory for Aboriginal people until 1984, while compulsory for others since 1924. The message was clear. Practical barriers remained. Many lived in remote areas with no polling places. Some couldn't register without documentation like birth certificates, which many lacked. Others were intimidated or didn't trust a government that had removed their children and denied rights. Queensland didn't remove restrictions until 1965. Even then, Aboriginal people on reserves or missions needed permission from reserve managers to leave and vote. The 1967 referendum didn't grant voting rights. Those came in 1962. It removed the constitutional provision excluding Aboriginal people from the census and gave federal government power to make laws for Aboriginal people. It passed with over 90% support, often presented as evidence of embracing Aboriginal rights. But it happened 5 years after federal voting rights and 2 years after Queensland finally allowed state voting. Australians were fine with Aboriginal rights in principle, as long as they came slowly. The fact that Aboriginal Australians were denied voting rights for over 60 years after Federation, with some states maintaining restrictions longer, demonstrates how deeply embedded racism was in democratic institutions. Fact 13. Aboriginal Australians were paid less than minimum wage until 1968. And speaking of rights that came shockingly late, let's talk about Aboriginal wages, or more accurately, the lack of them. From the late 1800s through to 1968, Aboriginal workers in Queensland, Western Australia, and the Northern Territory were often paid far below minimum wage, or weren't paid at all. Their wages were held in trust by government authorities who supposedly protected their interests. Those trust accounts were routinely raided, mismanaged, or never paid out. In Queensland, the Aboriginal Protection Act gave protectors control over Aboriginal earnings. Station owners would pay wages to the government, which was supposed to hold the money in trust and provide it to workers. Instead, much of it funded the system that oppressed them. Aboriginal pastoral workers did the same work as white stockmen, often working harder and longer, being paid a fraction of wages or nothing at all. Many received only rations, flour, tea, sugar, tobacco. That was their compensation for full-time labour. When the Gurindji people walked off Wave Hill Station in 1966, led by Vincent Lingiari, one demand was equal pay, not special treatment, equal pay for equal work. The strike lasted 9 years and became pivotal in Aboriginal land and labour rights. The stolen wages issue isn't fully resolved. Tens of millions of dollars were stolen over decades. Some states established compensation schemes, but they typically pay fractions of what was stolen and require documentation many don't have. And speaking of the government stealing from Aboriginal people, let's talk about nuclear testing. Fact 14. Britain tested nuclear bombs on Aboriginal land without consent. Between 1952 and 1963, Britain conducted nuclear weapons tests in Australia. 12 major tests and hundreds of smaller trials. The largest tests happened at Maralinga in South Australia and Emu Field, also in South Australia. The Australian government gave Britain permission. The Aboriginal people whose land it was were never asked. The Maralinga Tjarutja people had lived in that area for thousands of years. The Australian government declared their land a prohibited area, moved people off without explanation or compensation, and let Britain detonate nuclear weapons there. 7 nuclear bombs were exploded at Maralinga between 1956 and 1963. The contamination remains today. The tests weren't secret, they were announced. The government presented them as Australia contributing to British defence and therefore Commonwealth security. What wasn't announced was the radiation risk, the long-term contamination, or the fact that Aboriginal people were being displaced from their land, so Britain could test weapons of mass destruction. Some Aboriginal people weren't moved far enough away and were exposed to fallout. Others returned to their land after the tests and were exposed to residual radiation. The government never properly informed them about contamination. Some people found strange black substances, which were actually radioactive materials, and handled them without knowing the danger. The cleanup that finally happened in the 1990s was inadequate. They buried contaminated soil and debris in concrete-lined pits. The area is still contaminated. Signs warn people not to remove rocks or soil. Parts of Maralinga remain off limits. The land can't be used for traditional purposes. The contamination will persist for thousands of years. Britain never apologised to the Aboriginal people whose land they contaminated. Australia didn't apologise either until 1994, over 30 years after the last test. The compensation provided was minimal compared to the land that was rendered unusable and the health impacts suffered by people exposed to radiation. And speaking of land being taken without consent or compensation, let's talk about a different kind of theft. Fact 15. The Northern Territory intervention suspended racial discrimination laws. In 2007, the Australian government suspended the Racial Discrimination Act to implement what was called the Northern Territory Emergency Response, commonly known as the Intervention. They literally suspended laws against racial discrimination to implement policies that specifically targeted the Aboriginal communities. The intervention was announced in response to a report about child sexual abuse in Northern Territory Aboriginal communities. The government declared a national emergency and sent the army into Aboriginal communities. They implemented widespread measures, including compulsory income management, where welfare payments were controlled and restricted, alcohol bans, restrictions on land rights, compulsory health checks for children, and most controversially, they suspended the Racial Discrimination Act to do it. The measures applied only to Aboriginal communities. They didn't apply to non-Aboriginal Australians in the Northern Territory. If that's not racial discrimination, what is? The government's argument was that the emergency was so severe that normal protections against racial discrimination had to be suspended. The problem was that many of the measures had nothing to do with child protection and looked a lot like paternalistic control. Income management meant that a portion of welfare payments was restricted to approved purchases. The government decided what Aboriginal people could spend their money on. This was applied blanketly to all Aboriginal people in prescribed areas, regardless of whether they had any connection to the issues the intervention supposedly addressed. A grandmother living alone, who'd never been accused of neglect or abuse, had her welfare payments controlled the same way as everyone else. The intervention was extended multiple times, and many of its measures continue in modified form today. The Racial Discrimination Act suspension was eventually lifted, but only after significant international criticism and domestic pressure. The UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights criticized the intervention as discriminatory. International human rights bodies condemned it, but it continued anyway. The thing that makes the intervention particularly galling is that it was implemented without genuine consultation with Aboriginal communities. The government declared an emergency and imposed solutions without asking the people affected what they actually needed. Many of the issues the intervention supposedly addressed, like inadequate housing, poor health services, and lack of economic opportunities, were caused by decades of government neglect. The solution to government failure was apparently more government control. And speaking of governments implementing discriminatory policies while claiming to help, let's talk about missions. Fact 16. Aboriginal missions used children as forced labour government, and church-run missions for Aboriginal people weren't just about religious conversion or protection. They were also sources of cheap and forced labour, particularly child labour. Missions operated across Australia from the late 1800s through to the 1970s. Aboriginal people, especially children, were sent to missions where they were supposedly being educated and cared for. In reality, they were often working long hours in harsh conditions with little or no education and no pay. Girls at missions were trained as domestic servants. They learned cooking, cleaning, sewing, and laundry. Not for their own benefit, but so they could be sent out to work in white households. Missions would contract out girls as young as 12 or 13 to work as domestic servants. The wages were paid to the mission, not to the girls. The girls would work for years in other people's homes, earning nothing, while the missions kept whatever was paid for their labour. Boys were trained for farm labour or manual work. They'd work on mission farms or be sent out to surrounding stations and properties. Again, wages were kept by the mission. The children worked, the mission profited, and the children received only basic food and shelter. The conditions on missions were often terrible. Poor nutrition, overcrowding, inadequate medical care, and harsh discipline. Children were punished severely for minor infractions. Speaking their native languages was often punished. Any resistance to mission rules resulted in beatings or confinement. Some missions were better than others. Some missionaries genuinely believed they were helping and providing protection. But even well-intentioned missions operated on the assumption that Aboriginal culture needed to be suppressed, and Aboriginal people needed to be transformed into something resembling white working-class labourers. The goal was assimilation, and labour exploitation was part of the method. The Cherbourg mission in Queensland is a particularly stark example. Aboriginal people were forcibly moved there from all over Queensland. Children were separated from parents and housed in dormitories. They worked on mission farms, in mission workshops, and were hired out to surrounding properties. The mission operated as a self-contained labor camp where Aboriginal people could be controlled, confined, and exploited. Missions had their own police and could punish residents without trial. People couldn't leave without permission. Marriages required permission. Having visitors required permission. It was control at every level of life. And this continued into the 1970s. There are people alive today who grew up on missions under these conditions. And speaking of institutions that controlled Aboriginal people's lives, let's talk about reserves. Fact 17. Aboriginal people needed permission to leave reserves until the 1960s, and in some places into the 1970s. Aboriginal people living on reserves needed permission from the reserve manager to leave, to visit family in another area, to go to town, to look for work, to do anything outside the reserve required getting permission from a government-appointed white manager. Reserves were supposedly established to protect Aboriginal people from the worst excesses of frontier violence and exploitation. In practice, they became detention centres where Aboriginal people could be confined and controlled. Once you were on a reserve, you needed permission to leave, even temporarily. The reserve manager had enormous power. They controlled who could enter the reserve and who could leave. They could approve or deny marriages. They could remove children from families. They decided who got rations and who didn't. They enforced curfews and rules about behaviour, dress and language. They were essentially dictators over everyone on the reserve. This system created opportunities for abuse. Some managers used their power cruelly, denying permissions arbitrarily, punishing people for minor infractions, and running reserves like prisons. Others were merely paternalistic, genuinely believing Aboriginal people needed to be controlled and managed for their own good. But even well-meaning paternalism is still oppression when it removes people's autonomy. The permission system meant Aboriginal people couldn't travel freely in their own country. They couldn't visit family without bureaucratic approval. They couldn't take employment opportunities if the manager decided they shouldn't leave. They couldn't flee abuse or poor conditions without risking punishment. In Queensland, the Aboriginal Protection Act gave managers and police the power to arrest and return anyone who left a reserve without permission. They could be charged with absconding and punished. Imagine being an adult, committing no crime, and being arrested for trying to leave the area where the government has confined you. The reserve system wasn't officially ended until the 1970s. Some reserves transitioned to self-managed communities. Others were simply abandoned, leaving residents with no services or support. But for decades, Aboriginal people lived under a system of internal banishment, where they needed permission to exercise basic freedom of movement. And speaking of systems of control, let's talk about police violence. Fact 18. The Palm Island riots and death in custody cover-up. In 2004, an Aboriginal man named Mulrunji Dumaji died in police custody on Palm Island, Queensland. Within an hour of being arrested for public nuisance, essentially being drunk, he was dead. The police claimed he'd fallen. The autopsy revealed injuries consistent with being beaten. His liver was ruptured in 2 places. 4 ribs were broken. The injuries were so severe, the pathologist said they were comparable to what you'd see in a high-speed car crash. The police officer in charge, Senior Sergeant Chris Hurley, claimed Mulrunji had tripped and fallen. The investigation was inadequate. Evidence wasn't properly gathered. The death was initially ruled accidental. The Aboriginal community on Palm Island didn't believe the official story, understandably, given that healthy 36-year-old men don't typically die from falling down in police stations. When the community protested, the police station and courthouse were burned. The Queensland government declared a riot and sent in massive police reinforcements. They arrested dozens of people. The initial response to Aboriginal people protesting a death in custody was to treat them as criminals and flood the island with police. Eventually, Hurley was charged with assault and manslaughter, but he was acquitted. The trial was moved from Townsville to Cairns after defence lawyers argued he couldn't get a fair trial in Townsville because of the Aboriginal population there. That argument was accepted. An Aboriginal man was dead in police custody, and the concern was that the police officer might face a jury with too many Aboriginal people on it. The acquittal sparked further protests and riots on Palm Island. More arrests followed. Some of the people arrested for rioting were given longer sentences than most people convicted of manslaughter get. They were punished more harshly for protesting a death in custody than the officer responsible for the death. Mulrunji's death was one of many Aboriginal deaths in custody. Since a Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody reported in 1991, over 400 Aboriginal people have died in custody. The Royal Commission made 339 recommendations. Many haven't been implemented. Aboriginal people are still dying in police custody, at rates far higher than non-Aboriginal people, and prosecutions of police or corrections officers are rare. The Palm Island case revealed how the justice system protects itself. Police investigate police. Prosecutors who work with police daily are responsible for prosecuting police. The entire system has inherent conflicts of interest, and when Aboriginal communities protest these deaths, they're treated as the problem, not the deaths themselves. And speaking of justice system failures, let's talk about wrongful convictions. Fact 19, the Chamberlain case and trial by media. In 1980, 9-week-old Azaria Chamberlain disappeared from a campsite at Uluru. Her mother, Lindy Chamberlain, said a dingo had taken the baby. The police didn't believe her, neither did the media, neither did much of the Australian public. Lindy was convicted of murder in 1982 and sentenced to life in prison. Her husband Michael was convicted as an accessory. They were innocent. The case became a media circus. Lindy was portrayed as cold and unemotional. People decided she didn't grieve properly. She didn't cry enough on camera. She was too composed. She was Seventh-day Adventist, which the media treated as suspicious. Rumors spread that the name Azaria meant sacrifice in the wilderness, which isn't even true but was widely reported anyway. The prosecution's case was based on forensic evidence that later proved to be completely wrong. They claimed blood was found in the Chamberlain's car. It wasn't blood. They claimed scissor marks on the baby's clothing proved she'd been cut, not torn by a dingo. The marks were actually made by dingo teeth. The entire forensic case was junk science presented with confidence. Lindy spent over 3 years in prison before Azaria's jacket was found near a dingo lair in 1986, exactly where Lindy said the baby had been taken. This led to her release and eventual exoneration, but the damage was done. She'd been convicted based on bad science and public prejudice. She'd served years in prison for a crime that never happened. What makes this case particularly relevant to Australian history is how it revealed the willingness of the justice system, media, and public to believe the worst about someone based on essentially nothing. The evidence against Lindy was weak from the start, but she was convicted anyway because the story the prosecution told matched what people wanted to believe. The media coverage was relentless and prejudicial. Jokes about dingoes and babies became commonplace. Lindy was dehumanized and mocked. Even after she was exonerated, some people still believe she was guilty. The coronial inquest that finally confirmed a dingo killed Azaria wasn't completed until 2012, over 30 years after Azaria's death. The case exposed how criminal trials can become public spectacles where facts matter less than narratives. It showed how forensic science, presented with confidence, can be completely wrong and lead to wrongful convictions. And it demonstrated that being exonerated doesn't undo the damage of wrongful imprisonment and decades of public vilification. And speaking of the media spreading misinformation, let's talk about a different kind of trial. Fact 20. The White Australia policy deported war veterans. Remember the White Australia policy? It didn't just prevent non-white people from entering Australia. It was also used to deport non-white people who were already here, including war veterans who'd fought for Australia. During and after World War II, many Pacific Islanders and other non-white people worked in Australia or served in Australian forces. After the war, the government used the White Australia policy to deport them, even those who'd been in Australia for years or decades. The most notorious cases involved men who'd married Australian women and had Australian children. Under the policy, they could be deported back to countries they barely remembered or had never seen, separating them from their families. Australian women married to non-white men faced a choice between losing their husbands or leaving Australia themselves. Some Aboriginal servicemen who'd fought in World War II came home to find they still didn't have basic rights. They'd fought for Australia overseas and couldn't vote when they returned. They could die for Australia, but couldn't be counted as equal citizens. The policy also affected Chinese and Indian students who'd come to Australia for university. After graduating, they were often forced to leave, even if they'd lived in Australia for years and wanted to stay. Australia educated them, benefited from their tuition fees, then deported them because of their race. The deportations continued into the 1960s. The policy wasn't officially dismantled until 1973, which means people were being deported for racial reasons while Australia was supposedly embracing multiculturalism and progressive values in other areas. You could watch television shows about tolerance while the government was actively deporting people for not being white. And speaking of contradictions between official values and actual practice, let's talk about modern detention. Fact 21. Australia. Detained refugee children in offshore camps. From the early 2000s through recent years, Australia detained asylum seekers, including children, in offshore detention centres on Nauru and Manus Island. Children spent years in detention for seeking asylum, which isn't actually a crime under international law. The stated purpose was border protection and deterrence. The message was that boat arrivals would never be settled in Australia. They'd be sent to offshore detention indefinitely. The policy was designed to be harsh enough that people would rather risk death at home than come to Australia. Children were detained for years. Reports described severe mental health problems, developmental delays, and self-harm among detained children. Some couldn't remember living anywhere else. having been born in detention or arrived as infants. Conditions were harsh: inadequate medical care, poor food, violence between detainees, and abuse by guards. Multiple reports documented problems, but the government continued the policy. Doctors who spoke out were threatened with prosecution under laws making it criminal to disclose information about offshore detention. The secrecy was deliberate. Aid workers and medical staff were legally prohibited from discussing conditions. Journalists were denied access. The policy was defended as necessary for border security, but implementation was hidden from scrutiny. Some were eventually resettled elsewhere. Others remained in limbo for years. The thing about using cruelty as deterrence is that it requires actually being cruel. The policy couldn't be humane because the point was to be harsh enough to scare people away. And speaking of deliberate policy choices that harmed people, let's talk about housing. Fact 22. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy is Australia's longest protest. In 1972, Aboriginal activists established the Aboriginal Tent Embassy on the lawns of Parliament House in Canberra. They were protesting the refusal of the government to recognise Aboriginal land rights. The embassy is still there. It's the longest continuous protest in Australian history, and most Australians don't know it exists. The embassy was established after the McMahon government announced that Aboriginal people wouldn't be granted land rights. Instead, Aboriginal people on reserves would be given leases, which could be revoked. The activists erected a beach umbrella and a sign saying Aboriginal Embassy. The message was that Aboriginal people were being treated as foreigners in their own country, and therefore needed an embassy. The government tried to remove the embassy multiple times. Police tore down tents. Protesters were arrested. But the embassy kept being re-established. The protests became a focal point for Aboriginal activism and land rights campaigns. The embassy was where activists organised, where strategy was discussed, where resistance was maintained. Over the decades, the embassy has persisted. Different activists have maintained it through different eras. It's been burned, demolished, and rebuilt. Governments have tried to legislate it out of existence, but it remains, a physical reminder that the issues it was protesting in 1972 still aren't fully resolved. The embassy represents something important. It's Aboriginal people claiming space in the nation's capital to assert their rights and presence. It's a permanent counter-narrative to official versions of Australian history that downplay or ignore Aboriginal dispossession. It's uncomfortable for governments because it's literally on their doorstep, impossible to ignore. The fact that the embassy has been necessary for over 50 years says something about how slowly progress has come on Aboriginal land rights and recognition. The specific demands have evolved, but the fundamental issues remain: sovereignty, land rights, recognition, self-determination. These weren't resolved in 1972, and they're not fully resolved now. And speaking of unresolved issues, let's talk about water rights. Fact 23. Aboriginal communities don't control their own water. Many Aboriginal communities don't have secure water rights on their own land. In some areas, Aboriginal communities have to buy water from state governments to access water on their traditional country. In extreme cases, communities have been cut off from water supplies during disputes over payments. This is particularly absurd in areas where water rights were granted to mining companies or agricultural interests, while Aboriginal communities who'd lived there for thousands of years were denied equivalent rights. A mining company can get secure water rights to extract resources, but the Aboriginal community can't get secure water rights for drinking, sanitation, and cultural practices. Water is fundamental to Aboriginal culture in many areas. Sacred sites, ceremonies, and traditional practices are connected to water sources. When Aboriginal people don't control water on their land, they can't protect those sites or practices. They're at the mercy of whoever does control the water, whether that's government, mining companies, or agricultural interests. The Murray-Darling Basin is a stark example. Water in the basin is overallocated, meaning more water is promised to various users than actually exists in the system. Aboriginal communities are often at the bottom of the priority list. When there's not enough water, Aboriginal communities lose access before large agricultural users or mining operations. Some Aboriginal communities have successfully negotiated water rights through land right settlements or native title claims. But it's a complex, expensive legal process that requires resources many communities don't have. And even when water rights are secured, they can be conditional or limited in ways that other water rights aren't. The fact that Aboriginal people can't reliably access water on their own land, in their own country, while foreign-owned mining companies extract millions of litres for resource extraction, is a pretty clear indication of whose interests the system prioritizes. And speaking of systems that prioritize certain interests over others, let's talk about a military base. Fact 24. Pine Gap is operated by America, not Australia. Pine Gap, officially the Joint Defence Facility. Pine Gap is a satellite surveillance base near Alice Springs. It's on Australian soil, but it's primarily controlled and operated by the United States. Australia has limited oversight of what happens there. The facility was established in 1970 under agreements that give the US significant control over operations. Australian personnel work there, but the Americans are in charge. The exact details of what Pine Gap does are classified, but it's known to be involved in satellite surveillance, intelligence gathering, and missile defense systems. Here's the uncomfortable part. Pine Gap could make Australia a nuclear target without Australian governments having full control over the decision. If the US uses Pine Gap for operations that lead to conflict, Australia could be drawn into that conflict regardless of whether Australian governments agreed. The base makes Australia militarily useful to the US and potentially makes Australia a target for anyone who wants to strike at US intelligence capabilities. During the Whitlam government in the 1970s, there were concerns about Australian sovereignty over Pine Gap. Whitlam wanted more information about what the base was doing and more Australian control over its operations. Some historians argue these concerns about Pine Gap contributed to the CIA's interest in seeing Whitlam removed from office. The base was too important to American interests to allow an Australian government to start asking difficult questions. The agreements around Pine Gap are secret. We don't know exactly what Australia agreed to when establishing the facility. We don't know what constraints exist on Australian government oversight. We don't know under what circumstances Australia could ask the US to cease operations or leave. The lack of transparency makes it impossible to know how much sovereignty Australia actually retains over what happens at Pine Gap. And speaking of lack of transparency, let's talk about secret trials. Fact 25. Australia conducted secret terrorism trials. In recent years, Australia has conducted terrorism trials where parts of the proceedings were held in secret, closed to the public and even to the defendants themselves in some cases. Evidence was presented that the accused and their lawyers weren't allowed to see. People were convicted based on evidence they couldn't challenge because they weren't allowed to know what it was. The justification was national security. The evidence involved intelligence sources or methods that the government claimed would be compromised if disclosed publicly. But this creates a fundamental problem for justice. How do you defend yourself against evidence you're not allowed to see? How can a trial be fair if the accused doesn't know what they're accused of doing or what evidence exists against them? Special advocates were appointed to represent defendants' interests when reviewing secret evidence. But the special advocates couldn't discuss the evidence with their clients. They could see what the accused couldn't see, but they couldn't use that knowledge to help prepare a defense in ways that might reveal classified information. This system has been used in multiple terrorism cases. People have been convicted and imprisoned based at least in part on secret evidence. Appeals have been denied. Courts have accepted that national security concerns justify deviating from normal principles of open justice and the right to confront evidence. The problem is that once you create a system where convictions can be based on secret evidence, that system can potentially be expanded. Today it's terrorism cases. Tomorrow it could be espionage or national security or protecting trade secrets. The precedent that courts will accept secret evidence is dangerous regardless of how limited its initial use was supposed to be. Open justice, the principle that trials should be public and transparent, exists for good reasons. It prevents abuse, it allows scrutiny, it builds confidence that convictions are based on actual evidence and proper process. Secret trials undermine all of that. And while terrorism is serious and preventing attacks is important, we should be deeply uncomfortable with systems that convict people based on evidence they're not allowed to challenge. Fact 26. Mining companies destroyed Aboriginal sacred sites with government approval. And speaking of systems that prioritize certain interests, let's talk about how mining companies have been allowed to destroy Aboriginal sacred sites, sometimes with explicit government approval. In May 2020, Rio Tinto destroyed the Juukan Gorge rock shelters in Western Australia. These weren't just old caves, they were 46,000-year-old sites that contained artifacts and evidence of continuous Aboriginal occupation stretching back longer than most European civilizations have existed. They were sacred to the Puutukunti Kurrama and Pinikura people, who had maintained connection to these sites through tens of thousands of years. Rio Tinto blew them up to expand an iron ore mine. The company had legal permission. Western Australian heritage laws allowed destruction of Aboriginal sites if the company had ministerial approval, which Rio Tinto obtained back in 2013. By the time the full archaeological significance of the sites was understood, the legal permission had already been granted. The company claimed it was too late to stop the blast, which is a fascinating position to take given that they control when and how they blast. They could have chosen not to blast. They chose profit over preservation. The destruction sparked national and international outrage. Rio Tinto executives apologized and some lost their bonuses or resigned. But the sites are still destroyed. Apologies don't reconstruct 46,000-year-old rock shelters. The artifacts that were inside, some of the oldest evidence of human habitation in Australia, are gone. The cultural and spiritual significance to the traditional owners can never be restored. Juukan Gorge wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the one that got enough media attention to cause a scandal. Mining companies regularly destroy Aboriginal sites across Australia. Sometimes they have permission, sometimes they don't, and pay relatively small fines after the fact, which become just another cost of doing business. The The calculation is simple and brutal. The value of the resources extracted is greater than the cost of the fines. So destruction makes economic sense. The fundamental problem is that Aboriginal heritage protection laws in most states allow economic considerations to override cultural significance. A mining company can argue that the economic benefit of extraction outweighs the cultural value of a site, and governments, dependent on mining royalties and worried about jobs, often agree. The question becomes not whether the site should be protected, but whether protecting it is worth the loss of revenue and employment. This creates perverse incentives. Companies might delay archaeological surveys until after they've obtained permits, minimizing the risk that significant sites are found and create complications. They might argue that alternative mining methods that would preserve sites are too expensive, so destruction is necessary for economic viability. They position protection of Aboriginal heritage as a cost to be minimized rather than an obligation to be honored. And speaking of obligations that become costs, let's talk about stolen art. Fact 27. Australian museums hold thousands of stolen Aboriginal artefacts. Museums across Australia hold tens of thousands of Aboriginal artefacts, human remains, and sacred objects taken without consent. Museums call them collections. Aboriginal people call them stolen property. The most confronting items are human remains. Australian museums hold thousands of Aboriginal ancestral remains, including skulls, bones, and preserved body parts. These weren't donated for science. They were collected by anthropologists and museum curators who dug up burial sites or took remains from communities, often without permission. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a theory that Aboriginal people were a dying race and that collecting their remains and artifacts was preserving evidence for future study. This racist theory justified widespread looting of Aboriginal burial sites and communities. Some remains were from people who died in massacres. Some were from burial sites that were deliberately disturbed. Some were taken from hospitals where Aboriginal people died. The methods ranged from grave robbing to legal but deeply unethical collection practices that Aboriginal people had no power to resist. Repatriation has been happening slowly since the 1980s, but it's complicated. Many items have poor documentation. Museums don't know exactly where items came from or which communities they belong to. Sacred objects present different problems. Some were never meant to be seen by certain people. Some were meant to be destroyed after use. Having them in museums where anyone can see them violates cultural laws. Repatriating them isn't straightforward because traditional custodians may need to perform ceremonies that museums don't understand or accommodate. Museums are still reluctant to return items they consider historically significant. They argue they're preserving Aboriginal heritage, but they're preserving it in ways that make it inaccessible to the people whose heritage it is. And speaking of accessibility, let's talk about language extinction. Fact 28. Australia lost over 100 Aboriginal languages due to deliberate policy. Of the approximately 250 Aboriginal languages that existed in 1788, only about 120 still have speakers. Of those, only about 13 are not considered endangered. Australia has lost over half its Aboriginal languages, and most of the rest are at serious risk of disappearing within a generation or two. This represents one of the most catastrophic losses of linguistic diversity in human history. This wasn't natural language shift where communities gradually adopted new languages over generations. This was deliberate policy designed to eliminate Aboriginal languages. Children in missions and institutions were punished for speaking their languages. They were beaten, had soap put in their mouths, or were isolated as punishment for using their native tongues. The message was hammered into them physically and psychologically. Aboriginal languages were inferior, barbaric, primitive. English was the language of civilization and progress. Speaking Aboriginal languages was something to be ashamed of, a mark of backwardness that needed to be eliminated. The Stolen Generations policy specifically targeted language transmission. Language is primarily learned in early childhood through immersion in family and community. By removing children from their families and communities during the critical years when language is learned, the policy deliberately broke intergenerational language transmission. Children who were taken often grew up speaking English or perhaps a limited Creole, but not the full language of their community with all its complexity, nuance, and embedded knowledge. The loss of a language isn't just the loss of words and grammar, it's the loss of entire knowledge systems, cultural concepts, and ways of understanding the world that don't directly translate to English or any other language. Aboriginal languages encode deep knowledge about land, plants, animals, seasons, weather patterns, and ecological relationships built up over tens of thousands of years. They encode social relationships, kinship systems, and cultural practices in ways that English simply can't capture. When a language dies, accessing and maintaining that knowledge becomes exponentially more difficult, sometimes impossible. Some Aboriginal communities are working to revive their languages. They're using historical recordings, written records created by linguists and missionaries, and the knowledge of the last fluent speakers to teach younger generations. It's difficult, painstaking work. Reviving a language requires dedicated resources, trained teachers who understand both the language and language teaching pedagogy, and sustained community commitment over years or decades. It's easier when there are still fluent speakers who can teach naturally through conversation and immersion. It's much harder when working primarily from historical records, trying to reconstruct how a language sounded and functioned from written notes that may not capture pronunciation, tone, or cultural context. The federal government provides some funding for Aboriginal language programs, but it's woefully inadequate compared to the scale of the problem. Aboriginal languages are treated as heritage issues, something to be documented and preserved like museum artifacts, rather than as living languages with speakers who need support to maintain and transmit them. The approach is often about preservation, documenting languages before they disappear, rather than supporting communities to maintain living languages that continue to grow and evolve. And speaking of inadequate support, let's talk about native title. Fact 29. Native title requires Aboriginal people to prove continuous connection to land. Native title is legal recognition that Aboriginal people have rights to land based on traditional laws and customs. In practice, it's an extraordinarily difficult legal standard requiring Aboriginal people to prove continuous connection despite over 200 years of dispossession, removal, and disruption. The Marble decision in 1992 established that native title existed in Australian law, but the Native Title Act 1993 set the bar very high for proving it. Communities must demonstrate continuous connection to land according to traditional laws and customs. Here's the problem. The same governments requiring proof of continuous connection are the governments that forcibly removed people from their land, confined them to reserves, stole their children, and prohibited traditional practices. Aboriginal people are asked to prove they maintained connection to land they were forcibly removed from, using traditional laws they were legally prohibited from practicing. The legal process is expensive and time-consuming. Native title claims take years, sometimes decades. Communities need lawyers, anthropologists, and historians to build their case. They need evidence, often oral histories, because written records were kept by colonizers. Even successful claims don't grant full ownership. Native title is a qualified right that can be extinguished by government acts. It often doesn't include rights to minerals or resources. It can be overridden for public purposes. The process also creates problems within communities. Proving continuous connection sometimes requires demonstrating traditional practices remained unchanged since colonization, creating pressure to present culture as static rather than living and evolving. And speaking of static versus evolving, let's talk about child protection. Fact 30. Aboriginal children are still removed from families at alarming rates. Remember the stolen generations? Forced removal supposedly ended in 1970, but Aboriginal children are still being removed at rates far higher than non-Aboriginal children. Some call it the new stolen generations. In 2022, Aboriginal children made up about 6% of all Australian children, but over 40% of children in out-of-home care. That's massive overrepresentation. Child protection workers are supposed to act in children's best interests. But studies show bias in how Aboriginal families are assessed. Poverty is conflated with neglect. Extended family care arrangements, normal in Aboriginal culture, are viewed as unstable. Traditional parenting practices differing from mainstream norms are seen as concerning. The system is underfunded and overwhelmed. Workers have huge caseloads. They don't always have time for thorough assessments or to work with families to address problems. Removal becomes the default response rather than last resort. There's also the issue of kinship placement. When Aboriginal children are removed, they're supposed to be placed with Aboriginal families, preferably relatives. This doesn't always happen. Children are placed with non-Aboriginal foster families who may have no understanding of Aboriginal culture. The parallels to the stolen generations are uncomfortable. Government policy is no longer explicitly aimed at assimilation, but the outcome is similar. Aboriginal children growing up separated from their families, communities, and culture. And speaking of separation, let's talk about the church. Fact 31. The Catholic Church moved pedophile priests to remote Aboriginal communities. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which reported in 2017, revealed that the Catholic Church systematically protected perpetrators of child sexual abuse. What got less attention was that some perpetrators were moved to remote Aboriginal communities, where they continued abusing children. The pattern was consistent. When abuse allegations emerged, the response wasn't to report to police or remove the perpetrator from contact with children. It was to move them to a different location, often somewhere remote where they'd be less scrutinized. Remote Aboriginal communities became dumping grounds for priests accused or caught abusing children elsewhere. These communities already had less access to services and protection. They were isolated, often had limited police presence, and families had less power to push back against church authority. The church had enormous influence in many remote communities, running missions, schools, and services. Some Aboriginal community members tried to raise concerns about abuse. They were ignored, disbelieved, or punished. Some families were threatened with having their children removed or losing access to services if they caused trouble. The Royal Commission documented thousands of cases of abuse. Many victims were Aboriginal children in remote communities. Many perpetrators were moved multiple times, leaving trails of victims across different communities. The Catholic Church has apologized and paid compensation to some survivors. But apologies don't undo trauma, and the Church fought against some recommendations, particularly around mandatory reporting of abuse disclosed in confession. And speaking of institutions resisting accountability, let's talk about police. Fact 32. Queensland Police ran illegal surveillance on journalists and whistleblowers. In 2021, it was revealed that Queensland Police had accessed journalist metadata without warrants as part of investigations into leaks. They were trying to identify whistleblowers by tracking who journalists were communicating with. This was illegal and violated press freedom protections. Metadata includes information about who you called, when, how long the call lasted, where you were, and who you texted or emailed. It doesn't include content, but it reveals who you're talking to and when, which is enough to identify sources. Australia has laws supposed to protect journalists' sources. Journalist information warrants require high-level approval before police can access journalists' communications data. These protections exist because whistleblowers and sources are essential to journalism. Queensland Police bypassed those protections. They accessed journalist metadata without required warrants, claiming they were investigating serious crimes. They didn't tell journalists their communications were being monitored. When this was revealed, there was outrage. The police commissioner apologized, reviews were conducted, but damage was done. Sources now know that talking to journalists carries risks. Whistleblowers are less likely to come forward. This wasn't the only case. Australian Federal Police raided a News Corp journalist's home in 2019 over stories about proposed government surveillance laws. They raided ABC offices over stories about alleged Australian war crimes in Afghanistan. And speaking of those war crimes, let's talk about Afghanistan. Fact 33. Australian Special Forces allegedly committed war crimes in Afghanistan. The Brereton Report, released in 2020, detailed alleged war crimes committed by Australian Special Forces soldiers in Afghanistan between 2005 and 2016. The allegations include unlawful killings, executions of prisoners, torture, and a practice called blooding, where junior soldiers were ordered to execute prisoners to get their first kill as an initiation ritual. The report found credible evidence of 39 unlawful killings involving 25 Australian Special Forces personnel. These weren't combat deaths where soldiers killed enemy combatants in firefights. These were executions. Prisoners with hands tied behind their backs, shot in the head. Unarmed civilians killed in their homes, farmers working their fields, people shot for practice to inflate kill counts, or simply because they were there. Some incidents involved soldiers carrying throwdown weapons, usually old guns or radios, to plant on bodies after killing to justify the shootings as combat engagements. The report was the result of a 4-year inquiry led by Major General Paul Brereton, a respected military judge. It included testimony from witnesses within the Special Forces, some of whom described a toxic warrior culture within parts of the unit where rules of engagement were routinely violated and war crimes were normalized as standard operating procedure. Junior soldiers were allegedly pressured to participate in killings to prove themselves and become full members of the patrol. Those who objected or expressed discomfort were labelled weak, excluded from the group, or in some cases reportedly threatened. What makes this particularly dark is how long it went on and how many people must have known or suspected. These weren't isolated incidents by rogue individuals having bad days. They were patterns of behaviour over years, involving multiple units and dozens of personnel. Officers must have known, commanders must have suspected. Other soldiers witnessed these events. But nothing was done to stop it until the allegations became so serious and widespread that they couldn't be ignored or covered up anymore. The Australian government announced that prosecutions would be pursued and that the military would implement cultural reforms. But as of the time of reporting, very few charges have been laid, despite years passing since the report was released. There are serious concerns about whether meaningful accountability will actually happen, or whether the institutional desire to protect the military's reputation and avoid damaging morale will override the need for justice. The military justice system is investigating itself, which creates inherent conflicts of interest. The allegations have seriously damaged Australia's international reputation and strained relationships with Afghanistan. They've revealed deep problems with military culture, oversight, and accountability. They've raised questions about how soldiers could commit these acts, how the culture that enabled them developed, and why the military's internal oversight systems failed so completely to detect or prevent the war crimes. And speaking of oversight failures, let's talk about aged care. Fact 34. The Aged Care Royal Commission revealed systemic neglect and abuse. The Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety, which reported in 2021, described the aged care system as a shocking tale of neglect. It documented widespread problems including malnutrition, over-medication, physical and sexual abuse, and inadequate care that resulted in preventable deaths. The commission heard testimony from families who described finding relatives malnourished, dehydrated, covered in untreated wounds, or heavily sedated to make them easier to manage. It heard from aged care workers who described being pressured to cut corners, having insufficient time to provide adequate care, and being threatened if they raised concerns. One of the most disturbing findings was the use of chemical restraints. Elderly residents, particularly those with dementia, were being given antipsychotic medications not for medical reasons but to sedate them and make them less demanding of staff time. These medications have serious side effects and can hasten death. Physical restraints were also common. Elderly people were being tied to chairs or beds, not for their safety but for staff convenience. Some facilities kept residents in their rooms for extended periods because they didn't have enough staff to supervise common areas. The commission found that problems were systemic. Inadequate funding meant facilities didn't have enough staff. Poor regulation meant problems weren't detected or addressed. Corporate operators prioritized profits over care. The government accepted recommendations and promised reforms, but implementation has been slow. The fundamental problem remains. Aged care is expensive, and successive governments have been unwilling to spend what's actually needed. And speaking of unwillingness to spend, let's talk about climate policy. Fact 35. Australia approved massive coal mines. While claiming climate leadership, Australia presents itself internationally as taking climate change seriously. It attends climate conferences, makes commitments, and talks about net zero targets. Domestically, it continues approving massive new fossil fuel projects that lock in decades of emissions and make meeting those targets essentially impossible. The Carmichael coal mine in Queensland, now known as the Adani mine, is the most notorious example. Approved in 2019 after years of controversy, it's one of the largest coal mines in the world. At full capacity, it will produce tens of millions of tons of coal annually, all of which will be exported and burned in India and other countries, producing enormous amounts of CO2. The mine also requires billions of litres of water annually, in an area already facing serious water stress, competing with farmers and communities for increasingly scarce water resources. The mine was controversial from the start. Environmental groups, climate activists, and concerned citizens fought against it for years through protests, legal challenges, and public campaigns. There were legitimate concerns about climate impact, water use, threats to the Great Barrier Reef, from increased coal shipping through reef waters, impacts on Aboriginal land and sacred sites, and the basic question of why Australia would approve a massive new coal mine in the middle of a climate emergency. But the federal and Queensland governments approved it anyway, arguing that jobs and economic benefits outweighed environmental concerns and that coal is still needed globally. This wasn't an isolated approval. Australia continues approving coal and gas projects while simultaneously claiming to meet international climate targets and commitments. The argument offered to justify this is that Australian coal is supposedly cleaner than alternatives from other countries. So, exporting Australian coal actually reduces global emissions by displacing dirtier coal. This is creative accounting at its finest, ignoring the basic fact that coal is coal and burning it produces CO2, regardless of where it comes from or how it's extracted. Australia also uses various accounting tricks to claim emissions reductions, while actual emissions continue rising. Carryover credits from the Kyoto Protocol, essentially unused emissions allowances from previous commitment periods, were used to help meet Paris Agreement targets, which is like claiming you've lost weight this year because you lost weight 5 years ago. Land clearing rules were changed to allow more clearing while claiming forest preservation. And crucially, emissions from exported coal and gas aren't counted in Australian emissions at all, even though Australia profits enormously from their extraction and sale. By this logic, Australia can claim to be reducing emissions while being one of the world's largest coal and gas exporters. The disconnect between rhetoric and action is stark and increasingly difficult to hide. Government ministers attend international climate conferences and give speeches about Australia's commitment to reducing emissions and transitioning to clean energy. Then they come home and approve coal mines and gas fields that will operate for 30 to 50 years, long past the point when the world needs to have phased out fossil fuels to avoid catastrophic climate change. And speaking of catastrophic consequences of inaction, let's talk about the reef. Fact 36. The Great Barrier Reef has had 5 mass bleaching events. Since 2016, the Great Barrier Reef has experienced 5 mass bleaching events in just 7 years. 2016, 2017, 2020, 2022, and 2024. Mass bleaching happens when water temperatures rise and coral expel their symbiotic algae, turning white and becoming vulnerable to disease and death. Coral can recover from bleaching if temperatures drop and conditions improve, but when bleaching events happen frequently, coral don't have time to recover. The reef is dying. Parts that were vibrant coral gardens a decade ago are now dead rubble covered in algae. The Australian government has known about this for years. Scientists have been warning about climate change impacts on the reef since the 1990s, but the response has been inadequate. Plans and funding are announced, but they focus on managing symptoms rather than addressing the cause: rising ocean temperatures caused by climate change. The government talks about reef resilience and adaptation. It funds programs to develop heat-resistant coral or to manually intervene to help reef recovery. These are useful research projects, but they're like trying to save someone from drowning by teaching them to hold their breath longer while refusing to pull them out of the water. Meanwhile, Australia continues approving coal mines and gas projects. The government presents the Great Barrier Reef as a national icon, promotes tourism to see it before it dies, and funds research into saving it, while simultaneously approving the fossil fuel extraction that's killing it. UNESCO has repeatedly considered listing the reef as in danger. The Australian government lobbied hard against this classification, arguing they're doing enough to protect the reef. They're not. The reef is dying, scientists know it, the government knows it. And speaking of knowing but not acting, let's talk about housing. Fact 37. Negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions. Cost more than public housing Australia has a housing affordability crisis. Home ownership rates are falling. Rents are rising faster than incomes. Young people are locked out of the housing market. And government policies deliberately favour property investors over people trying to buy a home to live in. Negative gearing allows property investors to deduct losses from rental properties against their other income, reducing their tax. Capital gains tax concessions mean that when investors sell properties, they only pay tax on half their profit if they've held the property for more than a year. Together, these policies cost the federal government billions in foregone tax revenue annually. The argument for these policies is that they encourage investment in rental properties, increasing housing supply and keeping rents down. The reality is that most negatively geared properties aren't new builds increasing supply. They're existing properties that would exist and be rented out regardless. Investors are competing with first-home buyers for the same properties, driving up prices. The cost of these tax concessions is greater than the entire budget for social and affordable housing. The government spends more subsidizing property investors through the tax system than it spends building housing for people who can't afford the private market. Both major political parties support negative gearing and capital gains concessions. They argue that removing these policies would crash the housing market and hurt ordinary investors. But ordinary investors are part of the problem. When someone owns multiple investment properties while others can't afford to buy their first home, that's not a functioning housing market. The political difficulty is that roughly a third of federal politicians own investment properties. They personally benefit from the policies they're supposed to objectively evaluate. There's a direct conflict of interest. Meanwhile, homelessness is increasing. Emergency housing waitlists are measured in years. Renters are spending more than 30% of income on housing, which is the definition of housing stress. And speaking of housing stress, let's talk about media concentration. Fact 38. Two companies control most of Australia's media. Australia has one of the most concentrated media ownership structures in the democratic world. News Corp and Nine Entertainment control roughly 60 to 70% of newspaper circulation and significant portions of television and online news. This concentration of media power in few hands is a threat to democracy. News Corp, controlled by the Murdoch family, owns most major newspapers in Australia, including The Australian, The Daily Telegraph, The Herald Sun, and The Courier Mail. These papers have enormous influence over public opinion and political debate. The problem with concentrated ownership is that media outlets start reflecting the interests of their owners rather than serving the public interest. News Corp papers in Australia have been accused of partisan political coverage, climate change denial, and defending fossil fuel industries. During elections, this becomes particularly obvious. News Corp papers have been accused of running front pages that look like political campaign materials, attacking one side while promoting the other. The coverage isn't balanced journalism. It's advocacy journalism, where the editorial line is determined by ownership. The other problem is that concentrated ownership means fewer diverse voices and perspectives. When two companies control most of the media, alternative viewpoints and critical coverage of powerful interests becomes harder to find. Investigative journalism that might upset advertisers or ownership gets killed. Successive governments have allowed mergers and acquisitions that increase concentration, despite warnings from media experts and academics. The argument has been that media companies need scale to survive in the digital age. But concentration doesn't save journalism. It saves profits for owners while reducing diversity and quality of coverage. There have been inquiries into media diversity and the influence of concentrated ownership. They've made recommendations for reform. Governments have largely ignored those recommendations because the same media companies being criticized have enormous power to shape public opinion. The result is that Australia has media concentration that would be illegal in many other democracies. But it continues because the powerful interests benefiting from it are the same interests with the power to prevent reform. Fact 39. Political donations buy access and influence. And speaking of powerful interests preventing reform, let's talk about how Australia's political donation system essentially allows corporations and wealthy individuals to buy access and influence. Australia has relatively weak political donation laws compared to other democracies. There are limits on individual donations, but they're high enough that wealthy donors can still give substantial amounts. There are disclosure requirements, but they have thresholds below which donations don't need to be reported, creating a grey area where money flows without public scrutiny. The bigger problem is what donations buy. It's not usually direct quid pro quo corruption where a donation results in a specific policy decision. It's more subtle. Donations buy access. They buy meetings with ministers. They buy the opportunity to explain your industry's perspective. They buy consideration when policy is being developed. Mining companies are particularly generous political donors. They donate to both major parties, ensuring that regardless of who wins elections, they have relationships and access. When mining companies want environmental regulations weakened or new projects approved, they have direct lines to decision makers. Community groups opposing those projects don't have equivalent access. Property developers are another major source of political donations. They donate and then benefit from planning decisions, infrastructure spending, and zoning changes that increase their land values. The system creates at minimum the appearance of corruption, and possibly actual corruption that's just sophisticated enough to be legal. Some states have banned or restricted property developer donations after corruption scandals, but at the federal level, the system continues largely unchanged. Both major parties benefit from current arrangements, and neither has strong incentive to reform a system that helps them raise money. The result is a democracy where those who can afford to donate have disproportionate influence over policy. It's legal, it's normalized, and it undermines the principle that government should serve the public interest, rather than the interests of those who can afford to donate. And speaking of serving certain interests over others, let's talk about Pacific Islander labour. Fact 40. Australia practiced a form of slavery called blackbirding. Between the 1860s and 1904, approximately 60,000 Pacific Islanders were brought to Australia to work on sugar plantations in Queensland. Many were kidnapped or deceived into coming. They were forced to work in brutal conditions for little or no pay. This practice was called blackbirding, but it was essentially slavery with a different name. Blackbirding involved ship captains traveling to Pacific Islands, including Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and other locations, recruiting workers through methods that range from supposedly legitimate contracts to outright kidnapping and forced abduction. Some islanders were told they'd be going to Australia for a short time to work and earn money, then return home with their earnings. Others were simply taken by force, rounded up from villages or beaches, and forcibly brought aboard ships. Some were lured onto ships under false pretenses with offers of trade goods or gifts, and then sailed away before they realized what was happening or could escape. Once in Australia, these workers were often treated with shocking brutality. They worked long hours in harsh conditions, cutting sugarcane under the brutal Queensland sun, often from dawn to dusk with minimal breaks. They were housed in poor conditions, sometimes in barracks that were little more than sheds with minimal shelter. They were fed inadequately, given rations that were barely enough to sustain them through the physical demands of plantation labour. And they were paid wages far below what white workers received for equivalent work, if they were paid at all. Some plantation owners essentially enslaved their workers, using violence and threats to prevent escape and refusing to honour agreements to return workers to their islands after their contracted terms ended. The death rate among Pacific Islander labourers was horrifyingly high. Diseases they had no immunity to, particularly respiratory infections, and tropical diseases they encountered in new environments. Brutal working conditions in extreme heat, violence from overseers and plantation owners, and inadequate food and medical care killed thousands. Some estimates suggest that a third of all Pacific Islanders brought to Queensland died there, never seeing their homes or families again. The Australian government was aware of blackbirding practices and the terrible conditions Pacific Islanders worked under. There were occasional prosecutions of particularly egregious cases where evidence was overwhelming, but the practice continued for decades because Queensland's sugar industry depended absolutely on this cheap, exploitable labour. Without Pacific Islander workers, the sugar industry would have had to pay fair wages to attract workers, which would have made Queensland sugar less competitive. In 1901, as part of the White Australia policy's implementation, the government decided Pacific Islanders needed to be removed from Australia to maintain racial purity. The Pacific Island Labourers Act 1901 ordered the deportation of virtually all Pacific Islanders. Between 1906 and 1908, most were deported, often back to islands they hadn't seen in decades, or, in some cases, that weren't actually their home islands, because record-keeping was poor and authorities didn't particularly care about getting it right. Some had children born in Australia who were technically Australian citizens, but were deported anyway because they were not white. The deportation destroyed communities and families that had formed over decades. Pacific Islanders who'd lived in Australia for 20 or 30 years, who'd married and had children and grandchildren, who'd built lives and communities were forcibly removed with little notice or compensation. Australian-born children of Pacific Islander parents were taken from the only country they'd known, separated from friends and extended family, and sent to islands their parents had left decades earlier. And speaking of forced removal, let's talk about contemporary asylum policy. Fact 41. Australia refuses to resettle refugees to deter asylum seekers. Australia's current asylum seeker policy is explicitly designed to be harsh enough that people fleeing persecution would rather risk death than attempt to reach Australia. This isn't an exaggeration or interpretation. This is stated government policy. Deterrence through cruelty. Since 2013, Australia has operated a policy where anyone arriving by boat seeking asylum is sent to offshore detention or turned back at sea. They're told they will never be settled in Australia, no matter how long they wait, no matter how valid their refugee claims are. The policy is designed to send a message: don't come by boat. People who are determined to be genuine refugees, who've fled persecution and have legitimate claims for protection, are still not resettled in Australia. They're kept in limbo and offshore detention, or in countries like Papua New Guinea, indefinitely. Some have been in detention or limbo for over a decade. The policy has been condemned by the United Nations, human rights organisations, and legal experts as violating Australia's international obligations under the Refugee Convention. The Australian government's response is essentially that deterring boat arrivals is more important than those obligations. The argument for the policy is that it saved lives by deterring dangerous boat journeys. There were boat sinkings and deaths at sea before the policy was implemented. The government argues that harsh treatment of some asylum seekers is justified if it prevents others from attempting the journey. But this creates a moral calculus where the government deliberately harms some people to deter others. It means people fleeing war and persecution are being punished to send a message. And it assumes there are no alternative approaches that could achieve boat safety without indefinite detention. The policy has also corrupted Australia's refugee program. Refugees settled through official channels are sometimes treated with suspicion or resentment because of the political focus on boat arrivals. The entire concept of refugee protection has been politicized and weaponized. And speaking of weaponizing policy, let's talk about welfare. Fact 42. The robo-debt scheme illegally pursued welfare recipients. Between 2016 and 2019, the Australian government operated a scheme that used automated data matching to accuse welfare recipients of being overpaid and demand repayment. The scheme raised debts against over 400,000 people. The problem was that the debts were often wrong, and the way they were calculated was illegal. Robodebt worked by matching tax office data about annual income with welfare records. If there was a discrepancy, the system automatically generated a debt and demanded repayment. The system averaged annual income across all fortnights in the year and assumed income was received evenly, which is not how income works for casual or part-time workers. Welfare recipients received letters demanding they prove the debts were wrong. The burden of proof was reversed. Instead of the government proving debts existed, recipients had to prove they didn't. Many couldn't provide records from years earlier. The system assumed they were guilty and demanded payment. The scheme targeted some of the most vulnerable people in Australia. Welfare recipients, many of whom were living in poverty, were suddenly told they owed thousands of dollars and threatened with debt collectors. Some people paid debts they didn't actually owe because they couldn't fight the system. Some had tax refunds seized to pay debts. Some suffered serious mental health crises. In 2020, the government finally admitted the scheme was illegal. It had been warned repeatedly by lawyers, advocates, and its own legal advisors that the income averaging method was unlawful. It continued anyway for years. It only stopped when a federal court case forced the government to admit the scheme's illegality. The government eventually repaid the debts and paid compensation, but only after years of harm. Some people died by suicide during the robo-debt period, with families pointing to the stress of debt notices as contributing factors. A royal commission later found that the scheme had been unlawful from the start, and that senior public servants and ministers had ignored legal advice. And speaking of ignoring advice, let's talk about Indigenous health. Fact 43. The Aboriginal life expectancy gap isn't closing. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians have a life expectancy roughly 8 to 10 years lower than non-Indigenous Australians. This gap was supposed to be closing. It's not. Despite decades of programs, policies, and promises, the gap remains stubbornly wide. The reasons are complex, but not mysterious. Aboriginal Australians experience higher rates of poverty, inadequate housing, poor access to healthcare, and ongoing impacts of historical trauma. All of these contribute to worse health outcomes. Aboriginal Australians are more likely to have chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and kidney disease. They're more likely to die from preventable causes. They're more likely to experience mental health problems. They're less likely to receive adequate healthcare when they need it. Successive governments have committed to closing the gap, which includes targets for improving Aboriginal health, education, and employment outcomes. Some targets have been met, many haven't. The life expectancy target has consistently been missed. Part of the problem is that the approach has often been top-down. Governments develop programs without adequate consultation with Aboriginal communities. Programs are implemented in ways that don't account for cultural differences or community needs. Funding is inadequate or inconsistent, with programs cancelled or changed when governments change. Another part of the problem is that health is connected to everything else. You can't close the health gap without addressing housing, employment, education, and racism. Aboriginal people living in overcrowded housing with inadequate access to clean water and healthcare services aren't going to have the same health outcomes as people in comfortable suburban homes with easy access to medical care. The gap also reflects ongoing impacts of colonization and the policies we've discussed. The stolen generations created intergenerational trauma that affects health. Forced relocation from traditional lands disrupted access to traditional foods and medicines. The destruction of culture and language created mental health and social problems that persist today. Governments acknowledge these issues in speeches and policy documents, but acknowledgement without adequate action is just words. And while the gap persists, Aboriginal people continue dying years earlier than they should. And speaking of persistent problems, let's talk about education. Fact 44. Aboriginal students face systemic educational disadvantage. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students have lower rates of school completion, lower literacy and numeracy outcomes, and lower university participation than non-Indigenous students. This isn't because Aboriginal students are less capable. It's because the education system systematically disadvantages them. Aboriginal students are more likely to attend schools in remote areas with less resources, less qualified teachers, and fewer opportunities. They're more likely to experience racism from teachers and other students. The curriculum often doesn't reflect their culture or history, making school feel irrelevant or hostile. Attendance rates are lower for Aboriginal students, but this is often because of systemic issues rather than individual choice. Poor health, inadequate housing, lack of transport, and caring responsibilities all affect attendance. Some Aboriginal families don't trust schools because of historical experiences with institutions that stole their children. Suspension and exclusion rates are higher for Aboriginal students. Aboriginal children are more likely to be disciplined for the same behaviours that non-Aboriginal children aren't punished for. They're more likely to be identified as having behavioural problems rather than learning needs. The curriculum is another problem. Australian history as taught in schools still often minimises or ignores Aboriginal perspectives. The frontier wars, the stolen generations, and ongoing impacts of colonisation aren't given the same emphasis as Gallipoli or Federation. Aboriginal students learn a version of history that marginalises their own people's experiences. Teacher training often doesn't adequately prepare teachers to work with Aboriginal students or teach Aboriginal content. Teachers may have unconscious biases or low expectations for Aboriginal students. They may not understand cultural differences in communication or learning styles. Higher education participation rates for Aboriginal students have improved but remain well below non-Indigenous rates. Universities have made efforts to increase Aboriginal enrolment through targeted programs and support services. But Aboriginal students still face financial pressures, family obligations, and the challenge of being in institutions that weren't designed for them. And speaking of institutions that weren't designed inclusively, let's talk about LGBTQ+ rights. Fact 45. Same-sex marriage required a postal survey. In 2017, Australia held a postal survey asking people whether same-sex marriage should be legalised. This wasn't a referendum or a required vote. It was a non-binding postal survey that the government decided to hold instead of just legislating change. Most comparable democracies legalise same-sex marriage through legislation or court decisions. Australia made LGBTQ+ Australians endure a months-long public debate about whether their relationships deserved equal recognition. The survey campaign was often ugly. The No campaign spread misinformation and fear-mongering about same-sex marriage. LGBTQ+ people and their families endured public debates about their worth and rights. Young LGBTQ+ people particularly suffered, seeing adults argue on television and in newspapers about whether their identities were acceptable. Mental health services reported increased demand from LGBTQ+ people during the survey period. Suicide prevention organisations expressed concern about the impact of the public debate. The government's decision to hold the survey knowingly created harm. The Yes campaign won with 61.6% support. Parliament then legislated same-sex marriage, but the postal survey was unnecessary. Parliament could have simply passed the legislation. The government chose to hold the survey because it was politically safer than making the decision themselves. The postal survey was presented as giving Australians a say, but rights shouldn't be subject to popular vote. If the survey had returned a no result, would that have made it acceptable to continue denying LGBTQ+ people equal marriage rights? The premise was that a minority's rights could be decided by a majority vote, which fundamentally misunderstands how rights work in a democracy. Australia was far from the first country to legalize same-sex marriage. By 2017, over 20 countries had already done so. Australia was late, and the path taken was unnecessarily harmful. And speaking of being late to act, let's talk about corporate tax avoidance. Fact 46. Major corporations pay minimal tax in Australia. Many of the largest corporations operating in Australia pay very little tax relative to their revenue. They use legal but ethically questionable tax structures to shift profits overseas, minimizing their Australian tax obligations. The standard corporate tax rate in Australia is 30%. But effective tax rates for many large corporations are much lower. Some pay single-digit tax rates. Some years, major profitable corporations pay no tax at all. The main method is profit shifting. Companies structure their operations so that Australian subsidiaries pay inflated fees or charges to overseas parent companies. These payments are tax deductible in Australia, reducing Australian profits and therefore tax. The money ends up in low-tax jurisdictions. Technology companies are notorious for this. They earn billions from Australian consumers, but pay minimal Australian tax because their intellectual property is owned by entities in low-tax countries. Australian subsidiaries pay licensing fees to use that intellectual property, shifting profits overseas. Mining companies use similar strategies. They borrow from related entities overseas at high interest rates, making Australian operations appear less profitable while profits accumulate overseas. They use complex corporate structures that make it difficult to track where profits actually end up. The Australian government knows about these practices. There have been inquiries, reports, and proposals for reform. But change has been slow and limited. Tax law is complex. Corporations have teams of lawyers and accountants finding loopholes faster than government can close them. International cooperation is needed to properly address corporate tax avoidance. Profits need to be taxed where economic activity occurs, not where paperwork is filed. But reaching international agreement is difficult when countries compete to attract corporate headquarters with low tax rates. The result is that ordinary Australians pay tax while corporations earning billions in Australia pay minimal amounts. It creates a two-tier system where different rules apply depending on your resources and sophistication. It undermines faith in the tax system and the fairness of government. And speaking of government fairness, let's talk about public services. Fact 47. Privatisation has made essential services more expensive. Over the past few decades, Australian governments have privatised many public services that were previously government-owned. Electricity, water, transport, telecommunications, and more have been sold to private companies. The promise was that privatisation would increase efficiency and reduce costs. The reality has often been the opposite. Electricity prices have increased dramatically since privatisation in most states. Private companies need to generate profits for shareholders, which means higher prices for consumers. They've also invested less in maintaining and upgrading infrastructure than government-owned utilities did. Toll roads are another example. Governments have sold the rights to build and operate roads to private companies, which then charge tolls for decades. The toll fees often increase faster than inflation. The roads would have been cheaper if governments had built them using public borrowing. Public transport in some cities has been partially privatized, with private companies operating services under contract to government. The companies make profits while governments bear most of the financial risk. Service quality hasn't necessarily improved. The privatization of Telstra, Australia's main telecommunications company, was supposed to increase competition and lower prices. Instead, Telstra has maintained dominance while reducing investment in regional infrastructure. Internet speeds and coverage in Australia lag behind comparable countries. The argument for privatisation is that private companies are more efficient than government. But efficiency for whom? Private companies are efficient at generating profits, which means charging as much as possible while spending as little as possible. This might be efficient for shareholders, but it's not efficient for consumers who need affordable, reliable services. Government ownership isn't perfect. Public services can be bureaucratic and inefficient, but they can also prioritize public benefit over profit. They can invest in infrastructure that isn't immediately profitable but serves the public good. They can keep prices affordable because they don't need to generate returns for shareholders. Many of the assets that were privatized were profitable. Governments sold revenue-generating assets for one-time payments, then lost the ongoing revenue those assets would have generated. It's like selling your house to pay this month's bills. You might solve an immediate problem, but you've lost something valuable long-term. And speaking of losing something valuable, let's talk about journalism. Fact 48, regional Australia has lost most local newspapers. Hundreds of local newspapers have closed across regional Australia over the past 2 decades. Communities that once had daily or weekly newspapers covering local news now have nothing. This loss of local journalism has serious consequences for democracy and community life. Local newspapers did more than just report news. They held local councils accountable by covering meetings and decisions. They reported on local businesses, schools, sports, and community events. They created a sense of community by telling local stories. They gave communities a way to talk to themselves. Without local newspapers, local government operates with less scrutiny. Council decisions that might have sparked controversy if reported often pass unnoticed. Corruption or mismanagement at local level is less likely to be discovered and exposed. Community members lose a platform to raise concerns or share information. Local businesses lose an affordable way to advertise. Schools and community groups lose coverage of their activities and achievements. The closures are partly due to economic changes affecting all media. Advertising moved to online platforms, reducing revenue for newspapers. But they're also due to the corporate ownership of regional papers. Large media companies bought regional newspapers, cut costs to maximize profits, then closed papers that weren't profitable enough. Some regional areas have attempted to create new forms of local journalism through online community news sites or volunteer-run publications. These help but can't fully replace professional local journalism with resources to investigate complex issues. The loss of local journalism creates information deserts where people don't have reliable access to local news. They may not know what their council is doing, what issues affect their community, or what opportunities exist locally. This weakens local democracy and community cohesion. And speaking of weakened democracy, let's talk about voter suppression. Fact 49, electoral laws create barriers to voting. Australia has compulsory voting, which means turnout is high compared to countries with voluntary voting. But there are still barriers that prevent some people from voting or make it harder than it should be. The enrollment process requires stable addresses. People experiencing homelessness, domestic violence, or housing insecurity may have difficulty enrolling or keeping enrollment current. Indigenous Australians in remote communities may not have street addresses in the conventional sense. Voter ID laws proposed in some states would create additional barriers. People without driver's licenses or other photo ID would have to obtain special identification to vote. This particularly affects elderly people, young people, and people experiencing disadvantage. Polling booth locations matter. Remote communities may have limited or no polling facilities, requiring travel to vote. Urban areas with high-density housing may not have enough polling booths relative to population, creating long queues that discourage voting. Voting for people with disabilities can be difficult. Not all polling booths are physically accessible. Voting materials may not be available in accessible formats. People with intellectual disabilities may face challenges understanding how to vote. Prisoners in Australia generally can't vote if serving sentences of more than 3 years. Given the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in prisons, this disproportionately affects Aboriginal communities. These barriers don't prevent most people from voting. Compulsory voting and relatively good electoral administration mean turnout remains high. But barriers exist, and they disproportionately affect people who are already marginalised. And speaking of marginalisation, let's talk about a final overarching issue. Fact 50. Truth-telling and treaty remain incomplete. Despite decades of discussion and some progress, Australia still hasn't achieved meaningful truth-telling about its history or treaty with Indigenous peoples. The Voice referendum in 2023 was rejected, and fundamental issues remain unresolved. Truth-telling would involve comprehensive acknowledgement of what happened during colonisation and since. Not just admitting that bad things happened, but creating official, authoritative accounts of massacres, dispossession, stolen children, and ongoing discrimination. Some states have begun truth-telling processes, but there's no national framework. Treaty would involve negotiating agreements between the Australian government and Indigenous peoples about sovereignty, land rights, and self-determination. New Zealand has the Treaty of Waitangi. Canada has treaties with First Nations. Australia has nothing comparable at the national level. The argument against treaty is often that Australia is one nation and treaties would create division. But this ignores that Indigenous peoples never ceded sovereignty. They never agreed to British colonisation. The legal basis for Australian sovereignty is essentially, we took it and no one stopped us. The Voice to Parliament would have been a modest step toward giving Indigenous peoples formal input on policies affecting them. It was rejected by referendum in 2023. The No campaign argued it would divide Australians and create special rights. The reality was that it would have created an advisory body with no power to make or veto laws. The rejection was disappointing, but not surprising. Australia has a long history of rejecting or delaying measures that would give Indigenous peoples greater voice and rights. The 1967 referendum passed overwhelmingly, but it took decades to happen. Land rights were resisted for decades before partial recognition. Every step forward has been grudging and incomplete. The result is that fundamental questions about Australia remain unresolved. Who owns the land? What is the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Australian state? How do we acknowledge and address historical wrongs? These questions can't be answered without truth-telling and treaty, and both remain aspirational rather than achieved. We've covered 50 facts that challenge comfortable narratives about Australian history, from the frontier wars to contemporary political failures, from stolen wages to stolen children, from environmental destruction to democratic deficiencies. Australia's history is more complicated and darker than most people learn in school. These facts aren't presented to make you hate Australia or feel hopeless. They're presented because understanding history is necessary for changing the future. The problems we've discussed aren't inevitable. They're the result of choices, and different choices can produce different outcomes. Australia has also made progress. Some wrongs have been acknowledged, some policies have changed, some reforms have happened. But progress has been slow, incomplete, and often grudging. And many of the patterns we've discussed continue today in modified forms. The question is what happens next. Does Australia continue with comfortable myths and incremental changes, or does it confront its history honestly and make the structural changes needed to address ongoing injustices? That's not a question for governments alone. It's a question for everyone who lives in Australia. Sleep well, but when you wake up, remember what you've learned.